John, what did your old employer, Howie Roseman, love? I didn't prep you for this question, so you're trying to
Being the boss.
the boss. I was going to say studies. Didn't he love a good study, a good research project?
Lives for studies. Lives for studies.
So I did a little research project, and I'm here to tell you that Trey Lance is in a position, and the Niners put him in this position the second they drafted him, that no quarterback has been in since at least 1979. And in the last 30 years, nobody's even been close to this. No QB has ever been drafted in the top 10 to a team that was a bigger Super Bowl favorite than the San Francisco 49ers were when they drafted Trey Lance third overall in 2021. That is to say, no QB has ever walked into a pressurized win-now situation when drafted that high. That's the point of this. Nobody's ever walked into quite the win-now situation, and I'm basing that on odds. I can see MIDDLEKAUFF's wheels turning. He's going to look something up.
Well, I was thinking about the quarterback that just claimed that John Lynch called him, but I don't think he
Big
was.
Ben. I'll tell you, I did the research. I got all the numbers here. I went back to preseason Super Bowl odds dating back to 1979. And
he was the 11th pick.
He was the 11th pick. So I went top 15 picks. Okay. When the Niners drafted Trey Lance, they were 14-1 to win the Super Bowl. 14-1. Only one time has a top 15 quarterback been drafted with better odds than that to win the Super Bowl. Roethlisberger was a good guess, but it's not Ben. It was a guy that was taken 11th.
Mahomes?
2006. Jay Cutler. When the Broncos drafted Jay Cutler, they were 12-1 to win the Super Bowl. They were coming off a 13-3 season with Jake Plummer.
So they trade up to get Jay Cutler?
I didn't look, but I think they had to have. I mean,
Yeah.
based on a 13-3 season. Here are the other short odd teams to draft a quarterback.
I think Kyle told that story when they traded up for Trey. They said when his dad traded up for Jay, that the reason they did it is because Mike had to be so cloak and dagger about it, and we just didn't have the energy.
Interesting.
It's not even the energy. It is very, it's very, very difficult to do your due diligence without being caught.
Here are the other situations that are even close to what the Niners had.
Do you not count Mahomes because he was the backup?
I do count Mahomes. They were 25-1.
I guess Alex didn't quite get the love, huh?
No. 10th overall, they were 25-1, but that's really low. These are some of the short. I'm going to read you now some of the other really short odds. When the Jets drafted Sanchez, they were 40-1. They drafted him 5th. In 2004, I'm giving Eli to the Giants and Rivers to the Chargers. The Giants were 20-1. The Steelers were 30-1. In 99, Culpepper went 11th to the Vikings. They were 50-1. And that's it. Those are the guys in the last 30 years. If we go all the way back to 79, there were some guys outside of the top 10 that were close, like Tony Eason to the Patriots in 15, less teams. Elway, actually the Broncos in 83 were 50-1. Eventually they got him. But in the modern draft era, I'd say, no guy in the top 10 and hardly anybody in the top 15 is even close to this, but nobody in the top 10 stepped into a situation like Trey. So somebody just asked in the chat, what was RG3? The Redskins were 66-1 when they drafted RG3.
Yeah, they had not been a good team.
But those are short odds. Like when you look historically at teams that draft quarterbacks in the top 15, it's 20-1. It's 200-1. It's 300-1. It's 100-1. It's a lot more of that than 14-1.
I mean, just look at the draft this year. The Houston Texans, the Indianapolis Colts, who were terrible. Obviously, the Carolina Panthers. These are teams that haven't been in the playoffs for a minute. I mean, the Houston Texans have been drafting really, really high now for several years. Like, they've been awful. I would say their odds to make the playoffs are fucking huge, right? Yeah. I mean, that's typically, think about the year the Niners traded up to get Trey. Who were the two teams above them? The Jets, who had been awful and who were clearly at the time nowhere near as talented as they are now, and the Jags, who were really, really bad. So, I mean, these are when the Bengals got Joe Burrow. I mean, most times when these quarterbacks, like, it was unique, you would
200 to
say.
1.
You would say it was unique when the Chargers drafted that high, just because they had been hit or miss in the playoffs, but they had been in that 8 to 10 kind of range pretty consistently with Phillip, right? And then they just had an all-time shit year and drafted 6th. And that's why you would say that over the last 2 years they have been pretty competitive because their team actually was better than that. But that's pretty rare, you know?
Yeah, I mean, 80 to 1 for Mayfield's Browns was actually, people thought Baker was going to be
I think
a good player.
one thing this has really done is just completely changed my mindset of the difficulty of the transition it is for the young quarterback to come to a team with really, really high expectations. And I think when you roll it back to 2017, which I'm pretty sure was Mahomes' year, right?
Yep.
So the ability for Andy, who was adamant, he's not playing. He's not playing. And who knows? I mean, it's hard to see that they might not have been a little bit better by the end of the season with him, but
Sure.
It clearly, big picture, it has worked out. Like, that's an all-time great move, right? Letting him just take a deep breath.
Yep.
And they were Super Bowl favorite. This Niner team is better than them, like, right, just as a team. But from the expectations, like, he just kind of got to take a deep breath. Now, he was the backup quarterback, right? That's somewhat, I guess, not unique. I mean, it's just you're one injury away from having to play. And he did get to play at the end of the season. But, like, Kyle, when they drafted Trey, was adamant. One, he wasn't good enough to beat out Jimmy. And two, like, I'm not going to let the outside noises because we're good. And I think it's very, very difficult for the majority of guys. Clearly, Mahomes is like an all-time outlier. Like, he's headed toward fucking like Michael Jordan and Tom Brady territory. But just the average guy who's going to have like a Kirk Cousins level season, or I mean career, it's just really, really hard. I would say Dak. Now, he was a 4th-round pick, but that Cowboy team, I think, had a lot of hype. And he's very, very unique. Went in, and I think they ended up getting the number 1 seed his rookie year. But in a weird way, because he was a later pick, like if Dak Prescott had been the same, but had been the 4th pick, not the 4th round, it might have been a little different. Like, he got to be under the radar at first because everyone's like, oh, their season's fucked. And that's the different last year up until he got hurt. We felt it. Everyone felt it. It was like winning 8 games, winning 9 games is not going to be good enough. I mean, that's like, look at Justin Fields, who you and I specifically love the guy. But like last year, his quote-unquote breakout year, now his team's nowhere near as good. It actually wasn't that great beside the running element, and his team is drafting number 1 overall. But he got to just kind of just do whatever. There was no doing whatever. Look at Mac. Mac's a good example of like their team isn't good enough to have these sweet odds, but their expectations are like the playoffs. And you start feeling it by year 2. It's like, this ain't good enough, man. This is you got to play better. And that expectation for a young player, even Mac, comes from Nick Saban. It's really, really hard. Because that position,
30 to 1 was the
wouldn't you say that position more than any other in sports is just from the moment you start playing, you're just treated. You get the pressure like a star, whether you are one or not, just because you talk to the media the most. Everyone in the huddle's looking at you. The offense, unless you're going to be an all-time great running team, like, you have to pass the ball. Like, it is dependent on you to pass the ball for completions, touchdowns. Like, it's very, very difficult to just be a successful offense with you throwing like 12 touchdowns, right?
Yeah. It makes it harder for you to run. Like, there are all these things that you do that affects other things that your team does that aren't actually a result of your direct action on that play, right? If you can't throw, your team also can't run. Like, it works both ways. So I think part of the point of this is what you just said, right? You've kind of changed your perspective. So have I on what you view as a good situation for a quarterback. You need space to make mistakes, but it's also about, in the constant ongoing conversation about Trey, just acknowledging, even for whatever his shortcomings are, the things that we question with him as two guys that wanted them to draft him, that his situation is, we always talk about situations with bad organizations and bad teams, right?
Yeah.
Tim Couch and on, like that list the list is filled with guys who maybe wouldn't have been good anyway, but were not set up to succeed. Haskins and Rosen and Bortles and RG3. RG3 was a weird one. Tannehill, Jake Locker, Gabbert, Ponder. Like, what are you doing drafting Christian Ponder 12th? All these things. Well, if he goes 12th to the Chiefs and sits for a year, maybe it's a different animal playing for Andy Reid.
Shitty arm.
Yeah, it may not have mattered. Did lead him to a playoff, kind of.
One thing back to the Dak thing, and I think Jalen Hurts falls under this. In football, and just because so many in recent memory, it feels like more than ever, teams are trading up, not just for the number one pick, right? Just in the top 5 range to draft quarterbacks, and a lot of time early. Like, we've seen now several early trades, right? The Niners did it. Remember the New York Jets did it to get Sam Darnold. There is a pressure that comes on you regardless as a high, I'd say top 10 NFL pick. That goes for Solomon Thomas and Cleveland Ferrell to the quarterbacks who are infinitely more like under the microscope.
Yeah.
When you are like the Dak example, I'd put Jalen somewhat under this. I mean, these guys, especially Jalen, Alabama, Oklahoma. Like, we had been talking about Jalen since he was 18 years old because he was on the number 1 program in the country. And Dak, I mean, while he played at Mississippi State, which is a less famous Power 5 program, remember, he had them in, like, competing to be the number 1 overall team for a split second with Dan Mullen that year. So he was a relatively famous guy. When you are not drafted that high or no one trades up to get you, it's like there's just this less pressure on you. And I'm not saying that's the reason they succeed or that's the reason, like, it's easier for them, but it is way different. Like, there is an element and an elephant in the room every time Trey does something that is not comparable to what Purdy got to operate in last year. Or even, I would say, this year whenever he comes back. It's just like, oh, that's that 7th round pick. Now, eventually that changes, right? Like, Kirk Cousins was the 4th round pick, really good player, franchise tag. And then once you get this max contract, we start judging you at a higher level. But you get to roll with that, like, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. I think Jimmy and Derek were like that early on in their career. Once Derek got paid, that completely changes. But you get to have, like, a longer runway, which is something at that position which is already hard, which is probably pretty nice to have.
Well, it makes Jordan Love's situation so unique. On one hand, it's like, man, what an awkward spot. But on the other hand, wait, I get to sit for 4 years behind Aaron Rodgers with no expectation that I'm going to play? This isn't the worst thing in the world. There is an upshot to that.
Well, isn't that a good example of Aaron specifically, that he kind of got to – it's weird because he didn't get to ease into it in the sense that once he started playing, it was the number 1 story in the sport. But and I think Jordan's going to fall under this. It wasn't really as about Aaron as much as it was about Brett. Just like for Jordan, it will be about him, but the Aaron elephant in the room is much bigger than him.
You could also argue when you're a top 3 pick, Aaron was not, but Trey Lance was. The second you start, whether you're replacing Ty Detmer or Aaron Rodgers or Brett Favre or Jimmy Garoppolo, it's going to be a massive story. So either way, all eyes are on Jordan Love. Just like all eyes were on Trey Lance, at least Jordan Love's got 4 years of really learning and practicing and playing and watching in his back pocket, because either way, you're going to be on a really bright stage. You're an NFL quarterback for a legacy franchise. I mean,
yeah.
And in Trey's case, nobody's ever walked into a spot where the team was expected to win in the way the Niners were.
I think that matters too. I mean, the brand in which you take over, right? And that Jordan Love, the Packers are, for being the smallest market team in the league. I mean, they aren't just one of the biggest NFL brands. I would say they're just like a stalwart American brand.
Yeah.
You just say the Green Bay Packers does just a random woman, they know exactly who it is.
Yeah.
And I think the 49ers fall under that. I think the Steelers do too. And you just got to hope. And I think Jordan, I mean, he is taking over a team that, while they had a down year last year, they still won 8 games. Not like they're a 2-win team, right? They still have a lot of talent all over the place. That's what makes the Niners on a whole nother level. It's like, they're not like, oh, they got some talent. It's like, no, they're loaded with elite players. And now they have back-to-back years of, having, I guess, the game was tied, but they had the lead 2 years ago in an NFC Championship game and a tie game late into the second quarter last year with with their backup quarterback, who's actually, when you factor in their 4-string quarterback, so like the talent on the team is immense, and that adds to it.
And they were in a 1-score game in the NFC Championship game this year at one point.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
It was 7-7. Remember when
Yeah.
McCaffrey scored in the second quarter, and then they scored, and then Josh Johnson. I don't know.
The world changed. Yeah, the world changed as we know it forever. Do you think Kyle stops running Trey as much post-injury? I don't.
No.
But I'll be happy if he's just on the field and we get to see him play a little bit. But then there's a whole Brock element to get to. So it's complicated in a very different way this year. It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild.